For many years, there was a lone sentry guard, a military guard, posted outside the Kremlin in Moscow, Russia, for no apparent reason. And finally, this went on for years and years and years, and finally someone started questioning, why is this guard put here? And they started researching their history. And it went clear back to the 1700s when Catherine the Great, the ruler in Russia at that time, someone had given her a rose bush, and she planted it here at this place, and she didn't want anybody picking her roses, so she put a sentry guard there. The rose bush died eventually, and nobody knew to stop the guard, and the guard he's always there, and finally, I don't know if he's still there today or not, but he was put there for no apparent reason for many hundreds of years. Tradition. Sometimes tradition can really, if we get to looking back into the past, sometimes tradition can cause us to have a great awakening. We find our text today in the book of Luke, and the idea of simply Luke, let me turn this on, it might work better. Simply Luke, simply Jesus in the Gospel of Luke, where Jesus is dealing with some folks called the Pharisees. And the Pharisees were bent on tradition. They loved their tradition. They loved to come up with extra things to enforce on the people. And they were guilty of that. In this particular text, we see 4 different events. We see on this event, Jesus is the ruler over the Sabbath, and we'll talk about what that means and what was involved there. We see Jesus heals on the Sabbath, and that got him in trouble again. We see Jesus spend some time in prayer alone. And we see where Jesus chooses the 12 apostles. And those are the 4 events that we have in our text today that we'll be covering. But when we look at simply Jesus, we look at what he did. All of these things just simply tell us who Jesus was and what Jesus was willing to do. And we'll look at some things that may apply to us today, that he truly is just simply Jesus. He's our Lord. He's our Savior. And we turn to him. So simply Jesus, number 1, he rules. He rules over the Sabbath. If you followed along in our text this morning, Jesus was the one who is the ruler of the Sabbath, and some things were happening there. The disciples had plucked some grain and ate it on the Sabbath day. It wasn't so much that they plucked the grain, but they rubbed it in their hands. And to the Pharisees, that was the same as threshing. They were threshing grain on the Sabbath day, and that was against their tradition. And they said if you were rubbing it in your hands, you were doing something sinful. They had taken something good and turned it into something bad. They had taken something that was right and turned it into something wrong. The disciples were hungry, and yet they were allowed to eat. The Sabbath was one of the great characteristics of the Jewish religion. The Sabbath and the food laws that they had and circumcision and things like that were unique to the Jewish religion. And the Sabbath was one that the Pharisees really concentrated on, what you were allowed to do and weren't allowed to do on the Sabbath day. But Jesus was not restricted by man's traditions. Jesus turned a different way from that. Some of the rules for the Sabbath. We know that the Sabbath was created by God. It was a sign between God and Israel, Exodus chapter 31. The Sabbath was a memorial where God delivered the people from slavery. When God's people in Israel were in Egyptian bondage, Egyptian slavery, they didn't have a day off. They didn't have a day of rest. And one of the freedoms that God gave them when he brought them out under the leadership of Moses was to give them a day. He said, you're no longer slaves. You can have a day of rest. And that was the Sabbath day that he gave them, the 7th day or Saturday. So it was a sign between Israel. It was a memorial for God delivering them. And it was to recall God's sovereignty when God created everything. In Genesis chapters 1 and 2, God worked for 6 days and rested on the 7th. And that was to recall the power of God, to remind these people of that. But our rest is not here on the 7th day or the 1st day. Sunday is not the Christian Sabbath. Sunday is not a day of rest. Sunday is a day of worship. It's the Lord's day. Our rest is in heaven. Hebrews chapter 4 verses 1 to 10 says, there remains therefore a rest for the people of God. And he's talking about heaven. So Sunday is not a Christian Sabbath. There's no such thing as a Christian Sabbath here, but it's heaven. And that's something that we can look forward to. And that doesn't give us the right to go out here and just use this day any day we want to. It's still the Lord's day, and we need to focus on that. So, but Jesus was not restricted by man's traditions. Notice some things that were written concerning the Sabbath day and what these Pharisees thought. The main classes of work for the Sabbath day, the Pharisees said 40 save one. You know, they had the 40 stripes save one. They have 40 works save one on the Sabbath day. Let me share with you very quickly what they were. These are the things you could not do on the Sabbath day. You couldn't sow, you couldn't plow, you couldn't reap, you couldn't bind sheaves, you couldn't thresh or winnow or cleanse your crops. You couldn't grind, sift, knead, bake, shear wool, washing or beating or dyeing the wool. You couldn't spin or weave or make two loops. You couldn't weave two threads, but you could weave one. You couldn't separate two threads or tie or loose or sew two stitches. You couldn't tear something in order to sew two stitches. You couldn't hunt a gazelle. You couldn't slaughter or flay or salt it or cure its skin. You couldn't scrape it or cut it up. You couldn't write two letters. You could write one letter, but you couldn't write two letters. You couldn't erase one in order to write two letters. You couldn't build something. You couldn't pull down something. You couldn't put out a fire. You couldn't build a fire. You couldn't strike with a hammer. You couldn't take anything from one domain to another. And that's just a list of some of the things that the Pharisees came up with, what you were allowed to do and weren't allowed to do on the Sabbath day. We need to let Jesus be the ruler of our days. In Israel, when we were able to visit there back in January, there was something called a Shabbat elevator or a Sabbath elevator. The Sabbath elevator had no buttons. The Sabbath elevator was made so that you wouldn't have to push a button. If the traditional Jews or the Orthodox Jews that live today, they still felt they couldn't do any kind of work on the Sabbath. And this one particular elevator, if you got on it, you would be on it for a while because it would stop at every floor all the way up and then all the way back down, stop at every floor. And you could get on or off, but there were no buttons to push. They felt that pushing a button was work. So these elevators had no buttons to push on the Sabbath day. Pushing buttons was considered work, and the traditions often go beyond scriptural intentions. When they said no work, these people take it too literal and take it beyond what the scriptures say. So Jesus needs to be the ruler. As he is the ruler of the Sabbath, we need to make sure that he is the ruler of our days. Simply Jesus. Does he rule your life? Simply Jesus. As you focus on him, does he rule your day? Is he ruling your day today? Do you recognize Jesus as the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords over your life? Oh, sure, we say those things. He's the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. But do I apply that personally? Is he the king of my life? Is he the ruler of my life? Jesus is the ruler over the Sabbath, and he's the ruler over everything. So the disciples got in trouble because of traditions that they thought they were breaking, or that the Pharisees thought they were breaking. But Jesus says, wait a minute. I'm the one that's the ruler now. Simply Jesus, he rules. A second thing we can learn from this passage, simply Jesus, he heals. Also on the Sabbath day, look at verse 6. Luke chapter 6, verse 6. Now it happened on another Sabbath also that he entered the synagogue and taught. And a man was there whose right hand was withered. So the scribes and Pharisees watched him closely, whether he would heal on the Sabbath, that they might find an accusation against him. But he knew their thoughts and said to the man who had the withered hand, arise and stand here. And he arose and stood. And Jesus said to them, I will ask you one thing. Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do evil, to save life or to destroy? And when he looked around at them all, he said to the man, stretch out your hand. And he did so, and his hand was restored as whole as the other. But they were filled with rage and discussed with one another what they might do with Jesus. On this occasion, on Sabbath day, another Sabbath day where Jesus is meeting in the synagogues, and the Pharisees and the scribes, In the first section, the Pharisees came, and now they have the scribes with them, who are the teachers of the law, the ones who recorded the law. And so they have these two groups that kind of stuck together, and they were out to get Jesus. And in Luke chapter 6, verses 6 through 11, we see them where it's simply Jesus, he heals. He heals a man on the Sabbath day. We find here that the scribes and Pharisees were spying on Jesus. Their motive for coming to worship was not to worship. Their motive for coming to worship was to keep an eye on Jesus. What are you teaching, Jesus? What are you doing, Jesus? Simply, Jesus was doing what he always did. He was doing good. As Acts 10 tells us, he went about doing good. Here, Jesus is healing a man. Now, whether or not this handicapped man who had the withered hand, probably a paralyzed hand, whether or not the Pharisees and scribes placed him there or planted him there just to see what Jesus would do, I don't know, but that's a possibility. Whether he just showed up randomly that day and they see what he's going to do, or whether they said, let's go get somebody and see what Jesus will do. We don't know what happened there, but we know this man was there, had a withered hand. And Jesus asked the Pharisees and scribes a question. Well, what do you think here? Is it right to do good on a day like this or not? And we know that they had laws concerning animals. If your ox falls in the ditch on the Sabbath day, you could pull him out. Well, certainly if you do that to a person, you could do that to a man. Well, this handicapped man was there. In Matthew chapter 12, verses 11 and 12, it talks about the ox falling in the ditch, and it's right and proper to pull him out. But the scribes and Pharisees watched him closely. That was their reason for coming. I heard a story one time about a man whose wife was sick, and he went to church that Sunday morning, and he got home, and the wife started asking him questions. What was so-and-so wearing today? What was sister so-and-so's hat like today? And I don't know. What kind of tie did the preacher's tie and shirt match today? Well, I don't know. And she said, well, what good does it do you to go to church anyway? Well, that's the way some people come to church. Their motives are wrong. The Pharisees were wrong on this occasion. Their whole reason for coming to church, so to speak, was to watch him closely, just to see what he would do, see what he would say. Well, Jesus healed on this occasion, and Jesus taught them that the Sabbath was meant for good and not evil. The Sabbath day, as he was healing on this day, the Sabbath day was meant to give rest, to release from slavery, to offer healing, and so on. The Pharisees had a couple exceptions for this day. They saw that this man who was healed, they thought this can wait till tomorrow. This doesn't have to be done today. Their thinking was it's not an emergency. The Pharisees had two exceptions to the rule for healing on the Sabbath day. Or helping someone who is in trouble health-wise on the Sabbath day. Number one, if it was a matter of life and death, you could help that person on the Sabbath day. Or number two, if a woman is giving birth to a child, you can't stop that either. You can't wait till the next day to take care of that. That has to be taken care of today. But those were the only two exceptions. And they took exception to what Jesus was doing here. Here's a man, they thought this guy can wait till tomorrow. But Jesus healed him and said the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. The Sabbath was meant for good, not evil. So Jesus taught some great lessons there. And what we can learn from that is when traditions become more important than people, the traditions need to be changed. Perhaps you think in your life some of the traditions that your family has had through the years, and you wonder, where did some of those come from? Or it might be a tradition that you have had maybe in church growing up. Maybe something was done. And I recall many years ago, a little congregation back in the hills of West Virginia, that the communion table sat up front, and there was this folded piece of cloth that was over the communion. And every Sunday morning, it was very meticulously lifted up and folded. You could tell the folds were always there in the same place. It was folded and laid aside. And then when communion was done, they would pick it up and very, very religiously unfold it and lay it back over. And finally someone asked, why are you doing that? And nobody knew. Why do we do that? And finally someone spoke up and said, well, back years ago, we didn't have air conditioning and the windows were open. We didn't have screens on the windows. Now just to keep the flies off of it. But that had become such a tradition, and that same piece of cloth with those creases that were always there, it was just never changed. Well, we think of traditions and we think of what's important, and we go back and let's just see what God says about things. So when traditions become more important than people, those traditions perhaps need to be changed. So Jesus heals, simply Jesus. He rules our lives. Number two, he heals. It may be today that you have the problem of sin in your life, and Jesus is the one who can heal that. He is the great physician, and he heals the sin-sick soul. He can give us comfort and help and healing when sin overtakes our lives, and Jesus can heal your life today as well. Simply Jesus. We see him praying. Jesus was a man of prayer. He prays. And on this occasion, we see him praying. If you look in verse 12, Luke chapter 6, verse 12. And it came to pass in those days that he went out to the mountain to pray and continued all night in prayer to God. This is one of several occasions where we find Jesus going off by himself and spending time in prayer. And you'd think, why would God need to pray to God? But here we see Jesus, the Son of Man, in the flesh, having some needs and having some things that need to be taken care of, and he needed to go to the Father. Jesus had some reasons for this. Number one, his enemies were seeking his life. I don't know about you, but I've never been chased down and hunted down someone wanting to kill me. That hasn't happened yet, and I hope it doesn't. But I can imagine how stressful that might have been. I think back in the days of Elijah, we talked about this at our widow's dinner this past week, where Elijah was basically hunted down by Jezebel. And instead of praying to God, he started feeling sorry for himself, and I'm in this all alone and nobody cares, and where's God at? But here Jesus, when his enemies were seeking his life, he spent some time alone, but he spent it in prayer. He went to God to talk to God about it. But we also know on this occasion, Jesus prayed not only because he was going through this difficult time, but he was about to choose 12 men who would carry on his mission. He was about to choose the men that would be given the Great Commission, and the church would stand or fall on what they did. And we know that it stood. So Jesus chose 12 men. He prayed about that. But Jesus prayed for you. We know in in John chapter 17 where Jesus was praying, and he prayed for himself and the things that he was about to go through, the crucifixion. He prayed for his apostles that they would remain faithful and that they wouldn't give up and they would keep on going. But he also prayed for us, even today here in 2019. Jesus prayed, he said, I pray not for those alone, but also for those who will believe on me through their word. And if you believe in Jesus today, if you're a Christian today, Jesus prayed for you back almost 2,000 years ago that you would remain faithful, that you wouldn't be divided, that you would believe and you would stay faithful to him. Jesus prayed for you. But Jesus still prays for you today. He ever lives to make intercession for us. So Jesus is still praying for us today. Are you living up to your end of the prayer? If I know someone is praying for me, I will do my best to see that prayer is fulfilled. If someone is praying for me, I will do my best to show appreciation for that. And if you know that Jesus is praying for you, won't you today show your appreciation to him and say, I want to be faithful to you. I want to serve you. I want to be with you through eternity. He's praying for us. And these major decisions that he was about to make, the stresses, the pressures, the dangers of the ministry that he was in, these scribes and Pharisees that were out to get him. In fact, on this occasion, it says that they were discussing with one another in verse 11 what they might do with Jesus. And I believe their discussion was pretty negative. I believe they were saying, how can we get rid of this man who is causing us so much trouble? And they were trying to get rid of him. So Jesus is praying. So Jesus is one who rules, Jesus is one who heals, and Jesus is one who prays. We recall Jesus praying in the Garden of Gethsemane, and how that was a prayer that was heartbreaking, and yet Jesus went through that. But then when we talk about simply Jesus, we know that Jesus chooses. He makes choices. And here we find him choosing his 12, those 12 apostles. And it says they were chosen from among his disciples. So look at verses 13 through 16. And when it was day, he called his disciples to himself, and from them he chose 12, whom he also named apostles. Simon, whom he also named Peter, and Andrew his brother, James and John, Philip and Bartholomew, Matthew and Thomas, James the son of Alphaeus and Simon the Zealot, Judas the son of James, and Judas Iscariot, who also became a traitor. And some of the names there's a Thaddeus listed and different ones listed, and those are in the other Gospels, but some of these names like Judas, and he would be one that would be there. So Jesus chooses. He chooses these 12 apostles. And as he chooses the 12 apostles, he chose them because they would be sent on a special mission. He chose them not to give them honor, but to give them responsibility. He chose them not to say, this is something that's going to be good for you, but he chose them because he knew that they would be going through some very difficult times, and they needed the kind of strength and personality and perseverance to carry on. Jesus was going to send them on a special mission. Some of them were very similar. Some of them were fishermen. Peter and Andrew, James and John, perhaps a couple of the others were fishermen. They were professional fishermen, fish not with a fishing pole, but with nets on the Sea of Galilee. That's how they made a living. And some of them were very similar. Some of them knew one another. Some of them were related. A couple sets of brothers were involved. But some of them were very different. Simon the Zealot could be named Simon the Terrorist. If you knew that someone was known as a terrorist, you wouldn't want to spend a whole lot of time around them. But Simon was the terrorist among the bunch. He was against the Roman Empire. He was out to kill anybody who was for the Roman government. But then there's Matthew the tax collector, who worked for the Roman government, who was one who gathered taxes for them. And those two were in complete opposition to one another. And yet Jesus saw in both of them somehow, some way, these two have the personalities and they have what I need to work for me. It's interesting to me that we never hear from any of the apostles again except for Peter and James and John. Those are the three who are named by name, and we find them over in the book of Acts all the way through. But all of these others, they're not mentioned at all. They probably based for a while in Jerusalem. We know that some of the apostles stayed there and were elders in the church, but tradition tells us they went to different areas and different places, died different kinds of death. A lot of tradition involved here. But Simon and Matthew were very different, as opposite as opposites could be, and yet Jesus saw in them something special. Not everybody in this room is exactly alike, and I'm glad of that. There are some who have very strong personalities, some who are very passive, some who are aggressive, some who are go-getters, and some who are more laid back, some who are older and some who are younger. But everyone can be among the chosen ones of Christ. Everyone can be among those ones that Jesus says, I want you to follow me. Not everyone can be a leader, but those who are leaders also need followers. We have tremendous leaders, and we have tremendous followers. And what a blessing it is when everybody works together. These 12 men, I don't know how they work together. I don't know if Simon had to sit at one end of the table and Matthew at the other end. I don't know if they sat side by side. I don't know if they had some discussions among themselves about their differences or not. We just don't know. But we know that they were very different, but yet God had a special plan for each of them, and Jesus chose them to be his apostles. Jesus, simply Jesus, he chooses. But also among this group was one who turned against Jesus, Judas Iscariot. He was one who was chosen also because of his potential. Evidently, he might have been the financial wizard in the bunch, but his heart turned against Jesus, and his heart turned toward material things, and it was against what was really, really important. So Jesus chooses these 12 apostles, and Jesus chooses you today. If you're willing to choose him, he chooses you. If you're willing to be among the chosen, Jesus wants you to choose him. Would you today be willing to choose him? We see 4 different things here where Jesus, simply Jesus, is just who he is. Jesus is the one who rules. Jesus is the one who heals. Jesus is the one who prays. And Jesus is the one who chooses. He wants to be the ruler of your life. He wants to heal you of your sin-sick soul. He prays for you to come to him today. He wants to choose you so that someday you'll hear your name said, "Well done, good and faithful servant." Simply Jesus. That's who we follow. That's who we want to be like. That's who we want to spend eternity with. Simply Jesus. Would you follow him today? If you need to respond to become a Christian, to turn your life over to him, to be baptized into Christ so that your sins could be washed away, please do that today. He wants to be the king of your life. He wants to rule your life. And what a blessing it would be to accept that in your life. He wants to heal you of your sin. If, even as a Christian, you haven't been living as you ought to live, and you know that perhaps sin has come in and you want that removed, Jesus and the power of his blood can take that sin right back out of your life. He prays for you. He lives to make intercession for us. He prayed that you would be faithful to him. And he's ready to choose you today if you're ready to choose him. Would you come as we stand and sing together?